Welcome into the show today. It's a amazing weekend ahead of NFL football, particularly our favorite team, the Minnesota Vikings. The number one seed is on the line versus the Detroit Lions in a game that will decide if one of these teams has to travel to Los Angeles, Tampa, or Atlanta, or one of these teams will have home field advantage throughout the playoffs. The first 14-win team to ever be a wild card team is at stake this weekend. So let's preview this Minnesota Vikings-Detroit Lions matchup. First things first, let's take a look at the odds via DraftKings.com. The Detroit Lions are favored, as it stands right now, subject to change, by 2.5 points. The over-under total is 56.5, and the money line, if you bet $100 on the Minnesota Vikings, you would get a plus 124, and you bet the $100 on the Detroit Lions, you would get a minus 148 to win this game. All right, as far as this preview goes, there's a few big talking points ahead of this game that needs to be addressed. And one of my favorite resources for this game preview is to actually go to Vikings.com. You'd think that, you know what, and they might be homers because they're a Vikings.com outlet, but they do a good job examining things from both sides. They give good talking points. So I pulled a few nuggets that I thought was very interesting from Vikings.com. And the first nugget is, of course, how historical this game really is. Vikings versus Lions. Take a look at the history behind this game. Since playoff seeding began in 1975, this will be just the third time that two opponents have played in the final game of the regular season with the number one seed in a conference on the line. The 1979 Dallas Cowboys defeated the Washington Redskins, and the 1993 New York Giants topped the Dallas Cowboys. So this is the first NFL regular season game in which both teams have 13-plus wins before kickoff, and there is a lot on the line, which I already addressed. So one of the things that I think needs to be talked about is the earlier matchup. The Vikings lost to the Lions 31-29 by a last-second field goal. It went back and forth. Lions had the early lead. The Vikings made some plays, had a turnover for a touchdown late in that game. And late in that game, the Minnesota Vikings had a chance to put the Detroit Lions away by completing a 3rd and 4 pass, and they couldn't do it. So they lost 31-29. And the Vikings had the lead at that point. That put the game away, and that was one of the games that they couldn't quite pull off in the clutch. It was a close game, close loss. It was a good battle. Now looking at this game, something that wasn't available to the Minnesota Vikings in their prior matchup was a very impactful player. And that impactful player is none other than Minnesota Vikings defensive linebacker Blake Cashman. Minnesota is 13-0 this season in games with Blake Cashman. The Lions in Week 7 caught Minnesota during the first of 3 games Blake Cashman missed with a toe injury. But the Minnesota native will be in the lineup on Sunday Night Football. This is one of the best free agency additions this offseason that Kwesi Adolfo-Mensah pulled off. Grenard, Pro Bowler. Van Ginkel, Pro Bowler. But Blake Cashman deserved just as much to be in the Pro Bowl as those two defensive guys. But he just didn't get the nod. All right, some more Blake Cashman stats for you. Cashman leads the Vikings defense with 104 tackles and 63 solo. He's 5th on the team with 10 hits on quarterbacks and 8 passes defended, and 4th with 4.5 sacks and 8 tackles for loss. The 28-year-old is indispensable to Vikings defensive coordinator Brian Flores' group functioning in top form, and you can't argue against that. And I love this stat right here. When Cashman has played, Minnesota has allowed 331 yards of offense per game and 84 yards on the ground. and the unit's been extremely opportunistic, swiping 2.1 takeaways and notching 3 sacks per game. Without him, about the same yardage, 334 yards, but a lot more rushing, 106 to 84, with 1.3 turnovers, so less turnovers, and less sacks per game. So Blake Cashman's impact is indisputable, and his impact on the Minnesota Vikings defense is huge because Cashman affects so many other positions on the Vikings defense. When Cashman's in, Josh Metellus can float around and do his thing and not have to play that middle linebacker position. When Cashman's in, the defensive front can be solidified, and Van Ginkel and Grignard don't have to play these specialty positions for a down or two. Blaine Cashman, him being available, impacts almost the entire defense, because then guys got to play out of position, guys got to play more important roles like an Ivan Pace Jr., and him being available for this game is huge for the Minnesota Vikings. Something that will happen in this game, I can almost guarantee it, is the Detroit Lions going for it on 4th down. Because they go for it on 4th down more than any team in the NFL. And that is Dan Campbell's personality. It's an entertaining brand of football, and Campbell loves to go for it on 4th down. Just take a look at this stat. As the leader of the Lions, Campbell has instructed the offense to stay on the field and attempt to convert on 4th down on 147 occasions since 2021. Detroit has succeeded 82 times, 55.8%, both pace the NFL in that time frame. For comparison's sake, Vikings head coach Kevin O'Connell was hired in 2022 and has gone for it on 4th down 58 times and converted 32. So even though O'Connell has coached in one less season than Dan Campbell since 2021, he's hired a year later, Campbell has almost gone for it more than 100 times than the Minnesota Vikings led by Kevin O'Connell. So there's no doubt, with the number 1 seed on the line, Dan Campbell is going to be Dan Campbell, and he is going to be a risk taker, and he will go for it on a 4th down. The game might come down to, can the Minnesota Vikings stop the Detroit Lions on a 4th and 1 or a 4th and 2 and hold them to 0 points? Because at some point he is going to go for it. And whether it's a first quarter, second quarter, third quarter, fourth quarter, it doesn't matter. If he gets that 1st down and they score a touchdown, that will impact the game. And if the Vikings stop them, well, that's going to impact the game just as much. So a crucial part of this football game. One of my favorite things when taking a look at the Vikings.com website was taking a look at, statistically, Justin Jefferson's success against the Detroit Lions. And just yesterday, I did a podcast on a secondary player from the Detroit Lions talking smack about the Minnesota Vikings wide receiver core. He says, we're a bad matchup for Minnesota. They've got guys, but we've got cover guys, whatever that even means. But this stat proves that this Detroit Lions secondary player, Terrion Arnold, should have shut his mouth. Minnesota's earth-shattering wide receiver, Justin Jefferson, has recorded 730 yards against the Detroit Lions in 4 such games on the road in Detroit. And here's a look at his games. Jefferson caught 9 of 12 targets for 133 yards in Week 17 of 2020. In Week 13 of 2021, he went 11 catches, 182 yards, 1 touchdown via 14 targets. Week 14, a year later, Jefferson set the franchise regular season single-game receiving record with 223 yards, catching 11 of 15 passes. And his last performance against the Lions was 12 catches, 192 yards, 1 touchdown when he caught 14 passes in Week 18 last year. And you take a look at these averages, Jefferson averages 182.5 receiving yards per game versus the Lions on home turf. Jefferson has been dominant. And this idea that the Detroit Lions are a bad matchup defensively for the Minnesota Vikings is straight up bogus. Straight up bogus. Because Jefferson has had his heyday against the Detroit Lions secondary in Detroit. All right. Now, one thing the Detroit Lions do better than any other team in the league is score the ball. Detroit's offense leads the league this year with 33.1 points per game. Buffalo, 31 points a game, and Baltimore, 30 points a game, are the only two other teams averaging more than 30 points a game. Since week 14, Detroit's average per game has spiked to 37.5 points per game. So no doubt that this is going to be a huge part of the football game is the Minnesota Vikings' defensive ability to slow down the Detroit Lions offense. As far as prediction time goes, the line says the Lions are favored by 2.5 points, subject to change via DraftKings.com. Lions move up to kickoff all the time, so that could change. And the Detroit Lions offense is high scoring, but so is the Minnesota Vikings offense. They're not as high scoring as the Detroit Lions offense, but recently the Vikings offense has been clicking. 27 against Green Bay, 27 against Seattle, 42 against Atlanta. The Vikings offense is no joke. And against a injured defensive secondary and against an injured defensive unit on the Detroit Lions, I would expect the Minnesota Vikings to put up at least 35 points in this game, which in my mind means that the Detroit Lions will have to put up 37 to win. And I don't think they're going to do it. I'm not trying to sound like a homer here. And if you take a look at my last reel on Facebook talking about the Vikings celebration, everybody will think I am anything but a homer. Call me a Packers fan, tell me to STFU, tell me how much I suck, tell me how much I'm an idiot. And I don't understand lines and odds, and I'm not a betting guy, and I'm not analyzing that on a weekly basis or a monthly basis at all. I don't make bets. But when I take a look at this line, I am surprised that the Detroit Lions are favored by as many points as they are. In my mind, this game is a pick'em. In my mind, the Minnesota Vikings will win this football game because the Detroit Lions defense will not be able to stop the Minnesota Vikings. And in my mind, the Minnesota Vikings might not be able to stop the Detroit Lions offense the entire game, or at least, wait, 1 second. In my mind, the Minnesota Vikings defense will not be able to slow down the Detroit Lions the entire game, but at some point in the game, the Detroit Lions offense will not score on a possession. And the Minnesota Vikings defense has a takeaway in every single game this season. So expect that to continue on Sunday Night Football against a Detroit Lions team. So my analysis is fairly simple for this game. I don't think the Detroit Lions defense can slow down the Minnesota Vikings offense as much as the Minnesota Vikings defense can slow down the Detroit Lions offense. Two offenses are rolling, but the Minnesota Vikings defense is better than the Detroit Lions defense at this point in time. So even though the line says the Lions are favored to win, I actually expect the Minnesota Vikings to win this football game on the road and capture the number one seed in the NFC and have a home field advantage throughout the playoffs. So, Darnold, Jefferson, Addison, Hockenson, you take a look at how Kevin O'Connell schemed against the Green Bay Packers last weekend, and he did an incredible job of getting Naylor open and getting Hockenson catches and getting Jefferson and Addison involved. And I think it's going to be the same on Sunday. I don't know how the Detroit Lions defense slows down Kevin O'Connell's scheme. And you know what? In this game, the Vikings offense is going to pull out all the stops because they know how important this game is. The Lions know also how important this game is. They'll pull out all the stops offensively too. but I think that the Minnesota Vikings will win this game. The Vikings will put up 35 points on the Detroit Lions and beat them 35-31 and keep the Cinderella miraculous season going by capturing the number 1 seed in the NFC. So that's my take. Those are my predictions. Skull Vikings, and enjoy the game. Thank you for making this podcast a part of your day. Hit that subscribe button in the corner. And if you're listening on Apple, hit that follow button, or Spotify, hit that follow button wherever you are listening to this podcast. Appreciate you. Thank you for going on this journey with me on this lovely, lovely Friday morning.